Namaste, everyone, and welcome back to the Ramayana Odyssey Podcast. In this podcast, we take the time to journey through the Ramayana one story at a time. First, we listen to the actual story, and then in the following episodes, we take a minute to pause to reflect on its deeper meaning and explore how its wisdom applies to our lives today. In our last story, we arrived at one of the most sacred turning points within the Ramayana tradition as a whole. And Maharshi Valmiki had just returned from the banks of the Tamasa River, still carrying the mystery of the Mā Niṣāda moment within him. So he had witnessed sorrow and he'd spoken the first shloka, but he did not yet understand why that utterance had come through him in the form of the curse. But instead of running away from this question, he chose to sit with it for some time. And he was able to enter a state of absolute silence and stillness. And within this deep, quiet, inward state, Lord Brahma appeared before him. And Brahma revealed something extremely extraordinary to Maharshi Valmiki. That the Ramayana was not just to be the life story of Rama and Sita, but rather a guide for humanity. That Rama's life is Dharma lived as a human being, that the shloka form was necessary to carry this truth into the hearts of generations to come, and that Maharshi Valmiki himself had been prepared through his entire life for this sacred task. So, to reflect on this profound story, I'm joined once again by my dad, Rajesh Rabindranath, co-author of the Ramayana Odyssey. Welcome.
Thank you, Karna. This is one of the most beautiful turning points in the whole unfolding of the Ramayana.
So, just to get started, Acha, what really stands out to me in this story is the fact that Maharshi Valmiki doesn't rush towards an answer. Rather, he sits with the mystery itself and enters silence, which is when Lord Brahma finally appears to him. So, what does this teach us about the role of silence and reflection in receiving clarity?
This is such a powerful question, Karna. One of the most important things in this story teaches us is the value of silence. Here the point is that the silence is not emptiness. Silence is preparation. See, the primary tool we all have to solve any problem in the life is our mind. Whether it is a personal problem or a relationship issue or a leadership challenge or a spiritual question. Finally, the instrument through which we respond, we analyze, we plan, everything is our mind. So if the mind is agitated, reactive, restless, or emotionally scattered, then even if the truth is standing in front of us, we may not be able to receive it properly. We may not be able to apply it properly. So for us to be creative, productive, insightful, and capable of solving the right problem, the mind must operate in an optimal state. And in our tradition, this point is highly emphasized. For example, the Yoga Sutra tells, when the mind is controlled, you will be able to solve the problem. In fact, the Yoga Sutra defines different states of the mind and tells us to be in that most optimal state where you do have complete control over your emotional activity. The Bhagavad Gita repeatedly shows that the steadiness, the calmness, and the control of the mind is absolute must-have for solving any problem. Coming back to this story, what do we see here now? Maharshi Valmiki got into a situation. It was not easy. He was practicing meditation. He was practicing a lot of disciplines. But something came out of his mouth without much control. But the good thing is that he does not become noisy inside. He does not immediately try to intellectually address it. He allowed his mind to settle. And when the mind becomes quiet, clarity arises. That is the spiritual teaching you get from this particular story. And this is not just for spiritual seekers. This is equally applicable in modern leadership and modern life. Many times, the problem is not that we lack the intelligence. The problem is that our mind is too disturbed to see clarity. So, this story reminds us that if we want insight, we must learn to create that inner stillness. So, Kanna, you might be studying this a lot from your psychology and Gen Z perspective. What do you think silence is so difficult for the people today? and yet so necessary for the real clarity.
I think this is a question a lot of people my age are starting to ask now. But I primarily think that silence is so difficult to sit with and even achieve in the first place because we're living in a world where we are forced to keep up with it. And it's almost like we are seeking short-term gratification rather than just simply existing as is. And if we just simply look at the world around us, I think New York City might be a really good visual example for this. There is always something happening, whether it just be like people walking on the streets, someone talking, someone yelling about something. There is always something going on. And this even applies to ourselves in our individual lives. There's always like notifications on our phone. It's always content that we're seeing on our phones. We're always hearing people talk. There's so many like noises, distractions, and expectations all thrown on to an individual at any point in time. And I think that for this, especially with younger people, we aren't necessarily just surrounded by the noise that surrounds us, but also there's a lot of noise that comes from within us as well. So we are taught that we are able to get something almost instantly, which is what apps like TikTok and Instagram do. You can just keep scrolling and then get instant gratification as a result. And that really sets us in an unhealthy cycle in that sense. But as a result of that, so when silence comes, it feels very deeply uncomfortable because it's so foreign to everybody in my age. And this is primarily because, at least in my opinion, in silence, you're forced to face a lot of the things that feel uncomfortable and the things that you're trying to push away, such as confusion, sadness, uncertainty, or any other questions that are lingering in the mind at the time. And especially with such a busy world today, I think it's very common for a lot of people to stay busy rather than to sit with what they actually feel. They'd rather choose avoidance than actually dealing with the problem head on. But even with this, silence is something very necessary because at this point, like without it, there's no integration of the knowledge and you can never really confront the issues you're trying to avoid. So, from a psychological perspective, if you don't take the time to be silent and process everything, there's just no solution that's going to be attained out of it. It's possible for the body to react just from an emotional, physical standpoint, but we might not necessarily understand why it reacts that way. Similarly, we can say something, but we don't actually know what we're saying or why we're saying it. And I think this is why this story feels so relevant in the modern digital era today. Because Maharshi Valmiki doesn't escape the question, he doesn't avoid it at all, and he just allows it to sit in silence with him. And because he did that, that's why the transformation occurred at all. So I think one of the biggest messages for our generation in that sense is that silence is not an absence of progress. It doesn't mean that you're being unproductive. It actually means that you are being productive because that's where a lot of the deepest processing is occurring and as such is necessary to understand what's happening with us and everything around us. So to continue, Lord Brahma said something very, very profound here. He said that Rama's life is not merely the story of a king, but Dharma lived as a human being. So what does that really mean from a Vedantic and practical standpoint?
This is such an important line, Kanna. One of the beautiful things about Indian Itihasa tradition is that it is not history told just for information. It's history told for a purpose. So yes, there are events, people, decisions, relationships, battles, and historical memory. But all of that is presented in a way that reveals something deeper. And that is the Itihasa tradition. And in Ramayana, what is revealed is Dharma in lived human life. That is very important. So the purpose of Maharshi Valmiki or the purpose of the Sanatana Dharma is not to give us history lessons. It is to communicate that intricacies of Dharma through the life of a human being. Because Dharma is not just an abstract concept. It is not just a slogan. It is not something that can be fully understood by reading definitions alone. Dharma becomes meaningful only when we see how it operates in conflict, how it operates in grief, how it operates in duty, how it operates in relationships, how it operates when every available options have a cost. And that is why Brahma says, Rama's life is not merely the story of a king. Rama's life is the field in which the Dharma becomes visible. So, from a practical standpoint, this means that Ramayana is not asking merely to admire Rama. It is asking us to learn how truth, responsibility, sacrifice, restraint, and compassion functions in actual life. And from a leadership standpoint, this is also very powerful. Values sound beautiful in theory, Kanna, but their real meaning is known only when they are tested. So Rama is not just a noble character. He is the demonstration of what it means to hold dharma when life becomes complex. Now, moving on, Kanna, this story also shows us that truth has to reach not only the intellect, but also the heart. So, why do you think stories and poetry often teach people more deeply than direct instruction?
I think this is one of the most psychological, profound things that Hinduism and Sanatana Dharma as a whole utilizes. And this very much relates to empathy for me, at least in the way I think about it. Because people have so many different ways of learning information. There's like tactile learning, there's auditory learning, there's visual learning. But one type of way that you can learn things is through emotion, through empathy. And people don't only learn deeply through information, they can also learn through emotional connection. So with a story, they really engage things like emotions, memory, imagination, and identification, all things that are necessary to properly process something because you're reading it from a different perspective. And so when we hear a story, it isn't something that's just understood surface level in a mental way, not like you're memorizing it. Rather, it's if the writing is good, you very much enter it and then you feel it, imagining yourselves in it in a way where you have to remember it. And that's why I mentioned empathy before, because you are quite literally in another person's shoes. And with this, I think poetry adds another depth to it. Because not only does it add a sense of structure, poetry tends to be very descriptive in nature, at least a lot of the poems that I've read. And because it's so descriptive, it helps curate a more fine-grained environment. And they always say things like a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, I think a poetry or a story is the closest you could get to that 1,000 words, because obviously you aren't going to get every single perceptual detail if it's not an actual image, but you get pretty close with poetry and a story. So something that might have been forgotten as just a verbal instruction can very much stay alive in a person's memory through the emotions that they carry with it when it is carried through a story and a verse, like in poetry. And I think this is something very important today. And a lot of people, especially in like my generation, don't really respond deeply to just like abstract preaching with just information with no sort of like emotional connection. But they very much respond very well to authenticity, stories, and actual experience that people have gone through. And I think this is why the Ramayana continues to work. It really appeals to your emotions rather than telling you what to do. It allows you to see what a human life looks like when great values are being tested and they still come out winning. So I think Brahma really made a good decision when asking Valmiki to compose the Ramayana in this poetic-like format, because it is something that will stay consistent as long as humans can feel anything at all. So rather than it just being understood, it must be remembered, felt, and carried. And that's what makes the Ramayana so distinct in terms of actual textual orientation. So, Acha, this story begins with Maharshi Valmiki in uncertainty, but it ends with him receiving a sacred mission. So, what does this shift from confusion to calling teach us about how purpose is revealed in life?
That's a beautiful question, Karma. Sometimes we think that the purpose should come with immediate certainty, that before we move, everything should be completely clear. But as you know, life does not always work that way. Very often, the complete picture is not clear in the beginning. What we have instead is a sincere question, an unsettling experience, a felt responsibility, and the need to do the right thing is the best we can do. This story shows us that the purpose is often revealed gradually. Maharshi Valmiki did not begin with a mission statement. He begins with a mystery. He begins with sorrow, wonder, and a question he cannot immediately answer. But because he stays with it sincerely, because he does not run away, because he remains inwardly available, the calling becomes revealed. This is very important lesson. Sometimes we do not need the full map first. We need sincerity first. We need to do the right thing and move ahead with a prayerful manner. Clarity automatically unfolds. And this is true in spiritual life, in leadership, and in our day-to-day life also, Karna. There are moments when we will not see the whole road. But if we stay aligned, reflective, and prayerful, the next step becomes visible. And that is what happened to Maharshi Valmiki. What begins as confusion becomes a calling eventually. So, Kanna, one of the deepest lines in this story is that Valmiki was not chosen by accident, that his whole life had prepared him for this divine work. What do you think this teaches our generation about sometimes suffering, growth, and becoming ready for responsibility?
I think this is a very important question, especially considering this is the fundamental problem of existing as a human. But in my perspective, I think the fundamental thing to realize is that many people today and throughout history, we see this pattern, but they see suffering purely as damage, as something that is negative. It is true that suffering does inflict damage that can wound a human being. That is completely real, and it is completely valid to see it that way. But I think this story in specific shows us that when there is suffering, when it is processed deeply enough, it can help refine you as a human being. So we can see this with Maharshi Valmiki himself. His earlier life, he struggled quite a lot. He was stealing to get food, and he stole a lot from people. He harmed people, but he eventually was able to be disciplined with his tapas and such. None of that was absolutely wasted at all. Rather, it served as a kind of preparation. And I think this is something very relevant to a lot of people my age, because a lot of people feel like they are behind, that their struggles are ruining them, and their sufferings have only made their life harder. But this story implies that a person's suffering can become what makes them better. It can become their death. It can turn into compassion. It can turn into a kind of qualification. And it's important to realize that readiness doesn't occur at a single moment. It is built through a large period of time. So for this story, I really think the main message is that struggle isn't always as negative as you think it would be. In the short term, absolutely, it's going to be very difficult. But in the long term, it always has some sort of purpose in that you will benefit in some way from getting it. And I know this because I used to think like that as well before I reflected and saw how much my past struggles have led to me developing into a better human being in the future. And I think that is something that really gives us a lot of hope as a generation and for other generations to come.
Very well said, Kanna. That's such an important point, and I'm sure our audience also will be benefiting from this insight. So, Kanna, if you had to offer one take home message from this story to our generation, what would it be?
I think if I had to choose one, my main one would be not to avoid the difficult questions. And this could also involve struggles, not to avoid any difficult struggles or questions. Because not everything that is meaningful from these questions or experiences will come immediately. In fact, the more valuable it is, the longer the value of it will likely take to surface. So the most important thing, knowing this, we can do is to stay with the question or struggle and to allow silence to allow us to process what is going on over a period of time to eventually turn that into a sense of clarity and even growth, I would say. So my main thing is try not to be afraid of being still, of being uncertain, and don't assume that nothing is happening just because the answer hasn't come to you yet. And sometimes that's exactly the moment where you're being put for the answer. And I think that is something very important to realize and to not lose faith in. So, Acha, if you had to leave our listeners with one spiritual or dharmic takeaway from the story, what would it be?
I would say this, Kanna. Prepare the mind, because mind is the instrument through which the truth is received, understood, and lived. If the mind is restless, even the wisdom may pass by unnoticed. If the mind is prepared, even confusion can become a revelation. This story also reminds us that dharma is subtle. It's not always visible to a hurried mind. It requires reflection, humility, sincerity, and grace. And finally, the Ramayana is not just something to admire from a distance. It is meant to illuminate our own life. Let's not only appreciate this story, let us ask, how do I prepare my mind? How do I deepen my own sincerity? How do I become available to truth? That to me is the real takeaway, Kanna.
Thank you so much, Acha. This story feels very special in that it shows us that revelation doesn't always come with such grandeur as we often see in like movies or social media, but rather it can come in absolute stillness. And I think that is a message for all of us to remember. And to our listeners, thank you so much for being with us. If this reflection was meaningful to you, please do share your thoughts with us in the comments, and feel free to share this episode with others who might find it helpful. You can always also follow the Ramayana Odyssey podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcast. And until our next episode, we will continue this beautiful journey through the Ramayana. Until then, let's keep listening deeply, keep reflecting sincerely, and keep walking this sacred path together. Jai Shri Ram.